Hi, Gabriella.
Hi, Jane.
Welcome back to Hyphenated. Here we are again. And today we wanted to talk about different knitting techniques and how you could do different techniques no matter what level you're at, and also how to figure out what kind of level you might be at. And why is that useful information? Why would you want to know that?
I think sometimes in some patterns, depending on where you're getting them, they will say beginner, intermediate, advanced, or experienced beginner or something like that. And so if you're choosing a pattern and you're going to look at those terms or those categories, you may want to have a little bit more idea of where you are right now. And also, I think we wanted to talk about how to maybe push yourself to try a new technique or learn something new that isn't too daunting. How to tell, if it if you can just kind of push yourself to the next level.
Totally. I mean, yeah, some people are like, they don't mind just diving into the deep end with techniques, and other people want to take it more one step at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And at the other end of the spectrum, I guess, I've had customers tell me like, I've been knitting for 50 years, but I can only do blankets because I only ever learned the knit stitch and I don't know how to do any sort of shaping or anything, so all I can knit are squares in garter.
Right.
Which is fair too, if that's all you want to do.
Exactly.
But yeah, like Gabriella said, a lot of the bigger yarn companies that release patterns do put like a level, and some companies are, I know, like Brooklyn Tweed, for example, they have a very thorough description of what each level entails and how they determine what level a pattern is, difficulty level. But then there's, tons of independent designers on Ravelry who are releasing patterns, and how would you assess what level those patterns are, if you're ready to tackle it or not. And
well, that's what I asked you, right? I was like, on Ravelry, they have a section where you put, whether it's easy or hard, pattern. But you were saying
that's crowdsourced information, so that's totally subjective to the knitters. Basically, Ravelry displays the information that the Ravelry users input. And so if you're a more advanced knitter, you might rank a pattern as easy, whereas a beginner knitter might rank the same pattern as very difficult. So
right. So it's
not necessarily
not clear.
reliable.
It's yeah.
There's no standard criteria for that.
Exactly.
Information that's posted on Ravelry. So,
right.
Yeah.
So
but I
what
think
would you? Well, I was going to ask you, what would you consider to be the different levels, of like, what is a beginner?
Well, a beginner, I would say, knows the knit stitch, the purl stitch, and probably like one cast on or maybe two cast on techniques.
And
I know
binding
actually
off.
A lot of stores don't even teach casting on until the second or third project, just because it's something that is a little more entails a little more than the actual knit stitch.
Right. And it takes more time to learn. And I think the difficulty about casting on is that you only do it once per project, so you're not constantly practicing. And I actually had my when I was teaching knitting, I would have them have a couple of sets of needles, and one was to work on the project, but the other one was to practice casting on and binding off over, and rip it out and start over and over and over and over again, because it's hard in the beginning to remember if you're not practicing it.
So I would say, those four things, like knit, purl, cast on, bind off, are like the techniques you need to complete a project, a scarf, a blanket, anything that's a
doesn't really
square.
have it doesn't have any shaping to it or anything like that, or necessarily a pattern to it. So then what would be Is it experienced?
But I mean, you can do a lot of things with just those 4 techniques. You can do all kinds of stitch patterns, seed stitch, moss stitch, ribbing, garter, stockinette.
Right.
Like, you could do all kinds of scarves or blankets in all kinds of stitch patterns just knowing knit and purl.
I mean, basically what they say is everything else is a variation of knit and purl.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
After those 2.
So anything beyond that, I consider going more into like advanced beginner or even intermediate. And so I would say usually the next steps are learning some basic shaping, which refers to increasing or decreasing. So in order to make a hat, for example, you need to decrease the stitches to make the top of the hat. Well, actually, you can make hats without shaping, but the standard hat shape involves decreases.
Right. And more patterns, patterns, the world of patterns and stitch patterns are going to open up to you when you know decreases like knit 2 together or SSK or even purl 2 together or what yarn overs, right? I mean, all of that, it's like the world of stitch patterns all of a sudden opens up to you, as well as even shaping. More. Yeah.
So all those kinds of increases and decreases you can do then lace patterns and mesh patterns and open work patterns. And those can be relatively simple, like you have.
Oh yeah, I have an example here of a very simple lace pattern.
It uses yarn overs and it uses some decreases.
A knit 2 together and an SSK and yarn overs, and it has a purl and a knit, and that's it.
And it's simple because you can look at it and see it's fairly simple because it has a pretty regular pattern, and
it's repetitive and short. It's not an extended pattern with lots of different techniques over and over. It's pretty easy,
and it doesn't have like tons and tons of holes. I also find that makes it a little easier.
So here's something that would be a little bit more advanced for a lace pattern. So this has more holes, and it also changes.
It's less regular.
So it starts changing stitch. The pattern gets a little bit smaller as it goes. It's a little bit more intricate, not extremely intricate, but a little bit more intricate. Lots more holes. And I think that actually is what makes lace a little bit harder, is all the yarn overs and the holes in there, because you can make mistakes or drop them.
And it's harder to identify them,
yes.
and it's harder to
yes.
pick them up and fix them.
Yeah.
The holier the fabric is. And I think on the far end of the lace advanced spectrum is using very, very thin yarns and having lace patterning on both sides of the fabric. So
a reversible, you mean?
No, so many lace patterns you just do the yarn overs and increases and decreases on the right side.
Oh, yes.
And then the wrong side's just purling.
Yes.
And the super intricate laces, you're doing that lace action on both the right and the wrong sides.
Yeah, exactly. So that's more intricate. But there's some knitting patterns as well that are more intricate. But then, when we start getting into advanced, like what would you think would be advanced?
In terms of technique?
Yeah.
Like super advanced techniques. Things that I haven't even tried yet. Steeking would be one.
I tried steeking.
Reverse engineering.
Have
stitch
not done
patterns
that.
And cables and lace, that kind of thing. That's
have not done that.
Can be pretty tough, I think.
Brioche stitch?
Yeah.
It starts to get, it's not super advanced, but it starts to get advanced. Like those kinds of stitches.
Especially when you're doing increasing and decreasing in it.
So a brioche stitch, here's a sample of a brioche, like beginning brioche stitches. And then here's another 2-color brioche stitch pattern that changes colors.
And this
but the
one
cool thing Oh, go
pretty
ahead.
straightforward, right?
This one's pretty
This one,
straightforward.
But the other one,
But you can change, colors and stuff like that. The other one is a hair more intricate because it uses, in this particular one, it uses 3 colors, and then this particular pattern, you're actually knitting into the stitch into the row below, and so that starts to get a little bit more intricate. So yeah, and there's a whole world of stitch patterns, just like cables. There's a world of cables and cable techniques and cable patterns. There's also in brioche, there's a tremendous amount of patterns and different patterns in brioche and techniques in brioche as well. It's like its own category, just like stranded knitting, right?
Totally. Yeah. And
so I think stranded knitting isn't quite as hard.
Well, I think just like with cables or brioche, there's like a range. You can do easier, simpler patterns within each of those techniques.
So this would be kind of an easy stranded pattern. It's a simple repeat, and this is actually the same pattern, but it's just done on a smaller yarn, and the yarn did not have any gradient to it, so it looks pretty, what do you call it? It looks really kind of standard, whereas this one has a lot of change to it.
Because of the color changes.
The color changes, yeah.
So that's actually the yarn changing colors, not part of the pattern.
Right, which is what's so cool. This one, the yarn doesn't change color.
So that's like a way you can let the yarn do the work for you.
I like that.
When the yarn itself is, because of the way it's dyed, it changes color so that you don't have to like switch new yarns in. So stranded knitting, if you are unfamiliar with the term, is a type of what's called color work, where you're using more than one color in a project. And it means you're using more than one color per row. And
so you get these strands on the back.
Yes, and so Fair Isle knitting is a type of stranded knitting that I guess refers to the specific motifs from the Fair Isles.
Yeah.
If we're going to be technical about it, but people use them interchangeably a lot of the time, I think.
Right. And a lot of Fair Isle knitting, because they make sweaters, because it's cold, tend to have a lot of steeking as well, because it's you kind of don't do stranded knitting back and forth, right? Backside, wrong side, you do it in the round. So you'll see it like this is stranded knitting, it's the beginning of a hat pattern, and it's in the round, right? So you wouldn't be knitting the purl side row necessarily. And because they're doing sweaters, and you need to, if it's not a pullover and it's a cardigan, right, or a hoodie or a zip up or something like that, they actually steek, which is where they cut the center or they cut the knitting, and then they stabilize each end and put in button bands and put in zippers or whatever it is that they need to do. It's actually pretty cool.
And within the category of color work, there's also like very simple ways to incorporate different colors into your knitting. So even if you're at the beginner level and you want to do more than one color blocking is absolutely the easiest thing to do. So if you were doing a scarf, for example, and you say, oh, well, I've used up my first ball, time to join in a second ball of yarn, you could just join in a different color.
Right.
And there you have a color blocked scarf. And then also, this is garter stitch. You can just stripe your knitting, and that's a super beginner way to do some color work in your knitting.
And it's fun.
And
you can get really creative.
I love combining colors in knitting. That's one of my favorite parts of knitting. So yeah, those are some beginner color work techniques. And then in the intermediate level, intarsia would be another one. And intarsia is when you have like a big block of color where there's too many stitches in a row to strand the knitting, which means carrying the yarn across. So you actually work from a bobbin and just knit that section of color.
So you'll see that in sweaters. Like a good example is a Christmas sweater that has like, you know, a big, big reindeer face on it.
Yeah.
The rest of the sweater is red, and then you've got a brown reindeer face. The brown part would be the part that would be
intarsia.
Intarsia, it would be the part that's used for the bobbin, right? Or some of the antlers or whatever.
Yeah.
So those kinds where they have like a big flower or, you know, a panda or something like that.
Yeah. Anything that's a picture in different colors on a background.
Right.
So yeah, sweaters, hats. Yeah. What else? Slip stitching is another way to another color work. Well, it could be color work or it could not be color work, depending on how you whether you're incorporating colors.
Generally, a lot of the times people use color because it's a nice, easy way to do color work. It's not as advanced. I would say it's kind of intermediate, if that.
It's a little easier to handle than stranded knitting because you're not having to juggle two yarns
at a
actively in the same row.
Right. So it's more like experienced beginner or something like that. Yeah,
I would say so. A lot of it.
Yeah, and it's fun. That can be really fun.
Yeah, I was really when I started knitting, I was really into like learning a new technique with each project, so I was always trying to level up and look for each new thing I tried had to have a new to me technique in it. And I remember distinctly the first slip stitch pattern I tried. It was I made some like washcloths with, I can't remember the name of the technique, but I think it was called like ball band, I want to say, but it looked like little bricks on the washcloth.
Was that like mosaic? No?
I'm not, I can't remember what it's called, but I remember being so amazed at what was happening because I didn't really I was just following the directions. I didn't really understand what was going to happen, but it looked so neat and was also so easy to do.
I was going to show these guys. I forgot about those guys.
Oh yeah, that's also stranding. With 3 different colors, but only 2 per row at maximum, right?
Yeah, so it ends up being a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's cute too. And there's like super simple stranding where it just looks like little hearts in the pattern. I love that.
That was cute.
I think my first stranded project was one of those. Those are super cute. And cables is another one of those big techniques that I feel like look so much more complicated than it is. I remember kind of being hesitant to try cables for a while, and once I tried it, I was like, oh, that was really not hard at all. So I always say cabling is like one of those things that like gives you really good bang for your effort.
Totally.
Like if you want to look like, I'm a pro expert knitter, like just put some cables on something, and it's like not necessarily that hard. You can do hard cables, but
once you get going, it's like once you take that leap to learn how to cable, you're like, oh, it's a little awkward in the beginning because you're using a cable needle, but you'll get it. And a lot of these, like you said, it's like a big bang. It looks really cool. And some of those cables are not complicated.
Especially
but they
the ones
look
that
great.
just look like 2 twists, like a barber pole kind of
like
cable.
The bottom of this sweater is cabled. And it's not hard, but it looks really, it looks really, really cool.
And then, but how do you know if a cable's gonna be like easy or difficult if you're looking at a pattern?
Oh, for me, usually if they will have a chart, and I like charts. Some people don't like charts. For me, a chart is easier to read. And it's basically, it gives you the pattern by picture, right? Every little square on the chart represents a stitch. And they have symbols that will tell you whether it's a knit stitch or a purl stitch, or if you're going to be doing it like knit two together and then a yarn over or something like that. But usually what happens is, are there no yarn overs in cables?
Okay, so we're like a cable lace pattern?
Maybe. Okay, so anyway, I was just like, wait, are there? But for me, if it's a short repeat, like 8 stitches or something like that, then it seems easier to me. If it's really a long like chart.
So if the chart's massive.
If the chart, like if it's a short chart and it's repeats of those same things, like that seems really manageable to me. And it'll go not only horizontal because you're reading the chart across like you would reading a line or a sentence, but it also goes vertical because you're starting to move up your knitting. So I also like to see that it's not extraordinarily long where they're changing the cable pattern for too long. So I would say for me, like an 8-row, 8-stitch, 16-stitch repeat.
That's your magic number.
I don't know. I'm just throwing something out there, but it seems easier if it's smaller numbers than if you're having something that's like a 32-stitch repeat, and that's something like 50 rows long before you're going to repeat again. That sounds daunting.
I would say if you're an absolute beginner, if it's like your first time trying cables, you probably want one that doesn't even need a chart. Chart reading itself, in and of itself, is a skill. It's a
whole nother thing. Yeah, you're right.
I do like charts, especially for a more intricate pattern, but if it's your first time to try cables,
maybe something that doesn't have a chart. You're right.
Yeah,
you're right.
You might want one that literally has only one or maybe 2 types of cables. So, I remember when I first started knitting cables, and then I was like, oh, this is pretty easy. I'm going to try like a cabled sweater. And I immediately jumped into a cabled sweater, and it had, I think, like 8 different types of cables. So I was constantly having to refer to the chart, not only read the chart, but then look up the legend of the chart to see what I had to do for that cable. Like, was it forward? Was it backward? Was it...
Right.
How many stitches was it? So that was
like a whole nother level
on that. Like this hat, I remember this took me a while because the cables don't look that complicated, but I just kept getting lost in the chart. And
it's pretty cool though.
Yeah, it's a really cool looking pattern, but it did take me a while, and I remember I would just think I was in a different place on the chart, I think, just because of the nature of the pattern. Cables are another one where there's just a range of levels within it.
Right. And they can get super intricate. And of course, the thinner the yarn, probably the more stitches it's going to have and the more repeats. Right. So, yeah, it can get really intricate.
And the yarn itself is another kind of way you can advance your skills. So, like beginner yarns, we usually say pick something lighter colored. Don't pick anything like super dark, like black or really deep blues and browns, because it's so hard to see the stitches that way. And same with like heavily textured yarns. You want something, that's not too dark, not too thin, and not too textured. So lighter colored, worsted or chunky weight, smooth yarn. But then as you advance, you can start getting into all the different kinds of textures. Like right now, mohair and clay are having moments.
Right. Or variegated yarns or yarns that there's a lot of I mean, they were having like ribbon yarns for a while,
all the
and
novelty
yarns with what they called eyelash yarns and all that stuff. And Prism does a bunch of them, right?
Yeah,
Prism
so
that
like
does
the
a
Prism
bunch?
stuff, which is a yarn has a bunch of different textures in it, all strung together, and they make the beauty of those is that you can just knit a garter stitch scarf, and it comes out super fun with lots of different textures. But they are pretty tricky for beginners.
Very tricky. Hard to see if there's a mistake. Because there's so much texture, and because a lot of the times there's a few yarns that are actually strung together, that maybe you didn't pick up all the yarns together, all the strands, or you got it knotted in some way. So those can be, they can be even a little bit more difficult to rip back as well, because sometimes they can be textural or they can be slippery.
That's true. Those were very slippery yarns too.
So they just fall out of knitting. They just slink away, and
Yes. So that's also true for like a silk or viscose rayon yarn versus a wool yarn. A wool yarn's gonna, if you drop stitches, it's not gonna immediately drop down. It's not gonna become a bigger problem.
Right. Like the friction of the wool will hold the loop up. Whereas in a silk, it'll just fall right out. It's like, they're hard. They can be hard. Yeah.
Yeah, so delving into the world of different kinds of yarns is totally a cool way to advance your skill set and knowledge.
Yeah.
And then delving into shaping and construction methods of different types of garments. So the main ones that we think of would be sweaters, but there's also different construction methods for socks, for example, if you want to go
mitts.
all out on socks.
Yeah. Mitts. Some have, the thumbs, some have fingers, fingerless, but they actually have part of the finger. Some like socks, like you said, there's
all kinds of different heel constructions that you can
toe constructions, whether it's toe up or whether it's cuff down, right? Exactly.
And same with sweaters, top down, bottom up, seamed, seamless,
in the round,
sleeve,
right?
drop
Exactly.
sleeve, cap sleeve, set in sleeve. Like there's all sorts of different methods, and then within each of those, there's different ways to end up at the same result. Yeah, so that's a huge area that you can explore for a long time.
That's what I love about knitting, though, is that there's always something new to learn, and there's always something different to experience. And I think that's what makes it so interesting that, we're however many, I'm going on 16, 17 years more knitting, and I'm still learning so much. And what about you?
I kind of like, compared to my early days of knitting where I was like, I need to try all these different techniques, and I wasn't really even concerned so much about I was concerned about the finished object. I'd say I have always been a product knitter, but I was also concerned about each project teaching me something new, whereas nowadays I'm very content to knit like the most simple stitch patterns, because that's what I really want to wear usually. I'm not a big lace wearer, and not even cables so much. Like my favorite hats are just my like ribbed 1x1 rib or 2x2 rib hats, and my sweaters are my garter stitch or stockinette stitch sweaters.
But that's true, though. I mean, I think for me too, it was like I really wanted to. Now I'm just happy to really kind of relax around my knitting. But there is, I think, something I was going to bring up is like, if you've never done a sweater before, right? I've got like in my pile here. If you've never done a sweater before and you want to try making a sweater, but you don't want to, like, because you're just learning, and you don't want to worry about shaping and it fitting you and stuff like that. What I used to do is I would teach a how to knit a sweater, but we do it with the size of a baby sweater. So this has all the construction of a full-size sweater in a baby sweater, and it's a really great way to learn the construction of a sweater without spending a ton of money on a ton of yarn for a sweater that may not fit you in the end because you're going to make mistakes or something like that. It's a great way to try several different techniques. Mm-hmm. And this particular sweater is called Gramps. Mm-hmm. Is it Tin Can Knits? Yeah, they're great, and they actually do it in several sizes, so they go all the way up to adult sizes, and it's great because they teach you short rows and how to pick up the button band and how to do a pocket, and it has everything in there, even the little elbow pouches. So
yeah, it's super cute, and I definitely did a baby sweater as my first sweater because I wanted to try out how do you do this? And these are top-down raglans. Those are great first sweater patterns. And Tin Can Knits, actually, they have this great series of free patterns that is kind of designed to advance you through some of the beginner techniques of knitting. Yeah. I think it starts with a scarf, maybe? I don't know. The scarf, a hat. They have socks in this series and ultimately a sweater. And they're all laid out and, use language for beginner knitters. But yeah, baby sweaters are...
It's a great way to learn how to make a sweater. Yeah.
And, I fortunately at that time, I had a friend with a baby, so I was like, I'm going to make your baby a sweater. Because for me, I don't think I would be motivated to just make a baby sweater without knowing there was a baby who could wear it. So
right. Yeah, I mean, I did that sample for the class that I was going to be teaching, and it was it was a long class because every week we would have a different technique we were gonna tackle, so yeah, I mean, it's a great way to learn, but I don't have any babies in my life. I just have little dogs, so they don't exactly fit that sweater.
Did you find, did it take you a while to work your way up to knitting sweaters? How was your first sweater experience?
No, I threw myself in there. I think I can't even remember what sweater it was, and I don't have it anymore. But I think I did like a few scarves, and then I jumped right into a sweater. And it was a top-down raglan sleeve sweater. They, at the shop that I was learning how to knit, they picked the pattern for me. I had no idea. The sweater fit me. It was okay. It wasn't a great fit. And I wore it around for a while, but it wasn't necessarily a great sweater. I didn't wear it around that much, but it was really more about learning. And I did it in some really soft alpaca, so it did feel good. I remember it was a cozy wear around the house kind of sweater, not a wear out kind of sweater. It ended up being. I jumped in pretty quickly.
I remember having quite a few false starts with garment making. I think I put it off for probably like a year. I feel like I just stuck with scarves and hats, and then I was like, I'm gonna try to make a garment. And I remember trying to do some like nitty patterns or something, and I just didn't have the stamina to finish a garment before I lost interest or decided like this is not gonna fit. It's like coming out too small. I was struggling with the concept of gauge still, I think. And I didn't really have anybody around me who could help me out. So, I definitely remember knitting like pieces of garments and not finishing. And then I was like, okay, maybe instead of like trying to do a whole sweater, I did some shrugs. And I remember I did one shrug that was awesome because it seemed to be very little knitting, and it was in a bulky yarn, and it looked really great on the pattern. and I knit the whole thing, and then I'm like, this is tiny. And I realized the pattern was only in one size, and the designer was a very small person. Which
oh, there you go.
I'm not. But luckily, I had a friend who was that size, and I gave it to her, and she loved it. And then I remember knitting. There was, around that time, it was really popular on Ravelry for those like short sleeve sweaters. So I knit this thing that was like a short sleeve wool sweater with like a turtleneck, but it also like hung totally open in the front.
Oh,
like it
really?
just buttoned like right here. And I knit it because I was like, okay, that's like 300 grams of yarn.
Yeah.
That's gonna be like
Oh, our lights are flashing.
like almost no knitting.
Right.
And it was true. It was almost no knitting. And I finished it, and then I was like, what am I gonna wear this? Like, not a very functional garment.
Right.
So
Right.
I think finally after that, I started knitting actual top-down raglans, and then it actually took me a long time before I was able to knit a sweater that I really truly liked the fit.
Yeah.
Of same with hats. Actually, it took me. I knit dozens of hats, and I would say probably dozens of sweaters before I was able to get the fit down and figure out what styles I like and what what was going to work for me. So
one of the things that I had in the beginning that really messed me up, which I didn't realize, and I think it was because I wasn't hearing them. I was so hooked on the yarn, but I had come in with a pattern that I really wanted to make, and it had kind of these little puff sleeves, and it was short sleeve. It was super cute little like vintage knit sweater. And I fell in love with this red yarn, but the red yarn was silk. And the pattern, because it had puff sleeves, needed to have well, there goes our lights again. Needed to have a yarn that had more structure, sorry about that, you guys, than silk, which was going to droop. I mean, it has a lot of drape to it, so it's not going to stay puffed up.
Yeah.
And what I needed to have was like a wool or a wool blend or something like that. And I was so in love with this silk yarn and this color that I wasn't listening to the people in the knitting store, and I made this sweater that would have been so cute, but it was so droopy that it didn't fit the way that it should have because of the fabric that I chose, which that's the other thing to consider, is that if a sweater pattern says it calls for a certain type of yarn, try to get it as close as you can to that yarn. The designers chose that type of fiber for a reason, and a lot of the times it will make a difference.
Yeah, so that's a whole other world of knowledge to explore, matching yarns to patterns, and how do you substitute a yarn in a pattern, because it's not always just did I get the gauge, I can substitute this in.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I made that mistake even recently, choosing that floppy cashmere for a sweater that really would have been better in a much more
which sweater?
Stiffer yarn. My red cashmere light sweater that
I
ripped out last
right.
week.
Yep. In our rip out.
So,
yeah.
Yes.
Our rip out episode.
So that's totally a good point you make there.
Yeah, it was a bummer. I made the whole sweater. I love that yarn. Never wore the sweater. It was just floppy.
Is a bummer.
It was a bummer.
Yeah. Yarn and pattern mismatch. That's
it happens.
A sad thing in life.
Yep, it happens.
Sad thing. So let us know, what are some techniques you haven't tried, you want to try, you're afraid to try, you're excited to try. What's the hardest technique you've tried? Or what's your go-to technique?
Yeah, what's the most useful technique, right?
Ooh, that's a
short rows. We didn't talk about short rows. So for me, I'm just going to slip it right in here. Short rows. My favorite short rows are German short rows. I don't know why anybody would do any other kind of short row. I'm just saying.
I don't know enough about the topic to say.
Maybe
and I've
we'll
only
do some
tried
research.
the wrap and turn and the German short row.
Yeah, why would you do a wrap and turn? And then there's like a Japanese short row where you have to put a
haven't tried
stitch
that
marker
one.
on there. It's pointless.
Why would I wrap and turn? Because the pattern says so and I just do it?
Right, but you can do the same thing with the German short row where you don't have to wrap the yarn.
Okay, fair enough. But short rows are great for, that's another shaping technique, and they're great especially to raise the back of the neck of a sweater, because that was one of my pet peeves in my early sweaters that I knit, was the back neck hangs down low, and back of my neck's cold. I don't want that. Who wants that?
Right, exactly. So we can talk about that too. We can have a whole nother episode on what are your pet peeves. I have many. Yeah, I have many. Okay, so
don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying our channel, and we will see you next time. Bye.